We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Heather Dunn. She is the Chief People Officer at GEM. Heather, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Thanks, Christina, and thank you for having me. I feel very honored to be asked to be here today. Yes, Chief People Officer at GEM, have found myself in HR since I was 16 years old, which is a funny story for another day, but have done deep HR work throughout my entire career at places like Microsoft, Dropbox, a couple of startups, and have landed definitely at the best company of my career in working at GEM, which is a recruiting software platform. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And when I was growing up, I wanted to be a teacher. And I grew up in Michigan. I remember we have a basement in my parents' house, and we had a chalkboard. I wrote tests for all of the neighborhood kids and grading them. My sister was sort of my assistant in that. And funny enough, she became a teacher. I took this route. But it was definitely a part of my childhood and sort of reenacting what being a teacher would be.
I love that. We definitely have that in common. I had a big file of facts of just worksheets that
Yes.
I created and all of those things. And I think it's just interesting to see what our dreams were as kids. And I'm sure you're helping to teach and spread awareness every day in your job today as a leader of the people team and also working at kind of the best company, as you said. What are qualitative and quantitative ways you really think about measuring company culture, knowing that it's, of course, a dynamic process there?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where people leaders have been really pushed over, especially over the last 5 years, in quantifying a little bit more on company culture. But there is so much from a qualitative perspective that comes in. And so when I think about quantitative, we are doing things like running quarterly surveys, asking about engagement, belonging, inclusion, asking for suggestions and write-ins from that perspective. But I also pay attention to things like our Glassdoor reviews and candidate surveys and what our exit interview analysis is saying. Are there gaps in some of the things we think are happening versus what are happening in reality? And so I think there are some other creative ways that we've used data through those means as well. And then from a qualitative perspective, there's so much of like a feel. And the thing that's been hard, I think, for me over the last couple of years is sometimes you got that feel from being around others and hearing the chit chat and hearing how people are describing it. And so we've had to get more creative as people leaders to get some of that qualitative. And so for me, that a lot of that looks like, what are all hands like? At GEM, we've got folks that are just like pouring in the chat and like cheering each other on. And some of that feels like really strong, good culture. But also things like how are folks feeling about asking really hard questions to our leadership team? How often do those show up? And so I think there's something about energy. But then I also think that there's a transparency and faith in leadership and the confidence that people feel to bring things forward that absolutely comes into that qualitative assessment as well.
Absolutely. I think all of those factors are really important key ingredients, if you will, of company culture. And to your point, in terms of feeling and that energy, people can feel and experience culture in a lot of different ways, depending on where they are in the organization, where they are in their career. And there's been a lot of conversation around this idea of personalization at scale with, the employee experience and also as the team continues to grow. What does that kind of really look like at GEM, especially as you continue to hire and grow your team?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think sort of to start on the recruiting side, one of the things we've really paid close attention to is how can we give a candidate the feeling of what they're going to feel when they join GEM? And so big shout out to the recruiting team at GEM, who does such an incredible job of thinking about and paying attention to those nuances that people bring up. So a fun example of that was someone was like, hey, I'm going to a birthday party next weekend. Really looking forward to that as a part of their interview process. And a week and a half later, we sent them a cake to take to that birthday party. And to me, showing that we care, that we listen, that we're excited about the things that you have going on outside of GEM, those are really important elements of integrating into culture, and thinking, about how we can do some of those things at scale continually is important as well. But I think from once you are a GEM and you are here, I think this is really where equipping managers to have conversations with individuals on their team about, what do you want your brand to be? What do you want the next 2 years to look like at GEM? And to give a process and program for them to be enabled to have those conversations, I think is also a way that you're tying in sort of a program, and at scale, it's a process that happens, but it's furthering sort of that personalization of what is, Christina's experience going to be at GEM, because we've actually had that conversation on a regular basis. I know what you want your brand to be, and here's how I'm going to contribute to that success.
Yeah, absolutely. Asking those open-ended questions, having those conversations, and then to your point too, continuing that conversation too, because we know
Yes.
that can change, and also personalization at scale, open kind of accessibility to opportunities too, if other people at the organization have similar interests and needs as well. In that kind of similar vein too, in your experience, what is really important to ensure that really all employees at GEM, no matter where they sit in the organization, whether it's day 1, day 50, 5 years down the line, feel like they are truly part of that company culture?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I think one we've had to think more creatively about, particularly over the last 2 years. If I sort of bucket it first into joining a place like GEM, I think onboarding has never had more importance to organizations than it does now, because it's such a foundational, once in your tenure at a company time, that you have the space to really integrate, learn, read, meet people. And so some of the things we do, one is that, our onboarding program is so deeply rooted in our values, and making sure that folks have similar language coming out of that. It creates access points to our leadership team, who are actually guiding and leading those onboarding sessions and talking more deeply about them. It's talking about norms from the get-go. So, hey, we start meetings 5 minutes after the hour. Imagine being a new hire and you're showing up to all these meetings and everyone's late, right? And so I think the intentionality about making sure that sort of those norms, but also values and the access to leadership are really embedded early, are important pieces of feeling integrated and a part of the culture. But I also think once folks join and they're here, I think, of course, we have wonderful ERGs. We have quarterly offsites where people are flying in and getting together as a team. We're actually working on things like 2 times a year, we're actually going to have an all company offsite. And so does that mean that sort of takes care of making people feel like a part of the culture every single day? No, but I think it means that folks know and can expect when they're going to have the opportunity to engage in a very human way with other people at GEM, while also having things like Steve, our CEO, doing quarterly roundtables with all of our GEMs to create an access point to him. And as we scale, I think one of the things we talk about is, how do we continue to create those access points, ensure people are asking the tough questions like I was mentioning earlier, because I do feel like all of those touch points lead into somebody's broader experience and understanding of what the culture actually is here.
Yeah, all of those touch points are really important. And we say all the time, we're not fans of box checking to say, okay, we're meeting at this time. We have these meaningful moments of connection. So that's it. That's how we show up for our team
Right.
as well. It goes back to that conversation and kind of, what are the norms that you're saying? What are the values that you're living to? Because actions need to be in alignment with that as well. And I do want to get kind of specific too, because in terms of making sure people feel like they belong, there's been a lot of conversations around supporting intentionally working parents, which is
Yeah.
really important, as well as caretakers. I saw that GEM was named a great place to work for parents. How are you kind of intentionally supporting working parents at your organization with families from folks who have newborns to 18 years old?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think for any gems listening or folks that I've worked with in previous lives know that this is an area I'm extremely passionate about. I think not only because it's the right thing to do, but because I think it's actually a differentiator as we continue to think about talent and where we're hiring talent from and what types of experiences we create. So at GEM, when I joined in September, one of the first things I said was, look, we have an okay parental leave policy, but to me, this is an area to be industry leading and for our size and stage. And so after taking a look at all of the benchmarks, we were like, okay, and we're going to move that up to 16 weeks for both childbearing and non-childbearing. But that also comes with Cocoon, which is going to be a system that's going to support your leave. And we're now working on, actually have a meeting later today to finalize what does returning from leave look like. So we're working to institute 4-day work weeks for new parents for the first month or two after they return. They're going to have a buddy, somebody that's gone through the experience before, and it's just a safe space for them to talk to, are there like manager guides that we need to put out and make sure managers are reintegrating folks in the right way. And so from the new parent perspective, there's been a lot of work that we've been more recently doing. And then, our culture has always, even prior to the pandemic, been around bringing your whole self that you feel comfortable bringing to work. And so how do we support the flexibility that's needed, whether that's like, hey, I'm going to be off for 2 hours. I've got my kid's appointment. That, of course, that's part of the culture. You don't even need to ask that. We are adults working here with lives and different needs. To moving to unlimited PTO for us, that was really, really important because we don't want people to feel locked into when things have accrued and I can't take this time because my kid's school is shut down today because I don't have a day to take. So how do we continue to find ways of flexibility there that I think we on that front can do an even more continued job looking at that I'm super excited about that journey and continue to move on that journey.
Yeah, I like how it is a journey and the word you used for a cocoon of a support system there, because I think it's really important to think about. I love the 4-day work week, the buddy, and making sure that people are aware of the benefits and as they are changing as well. Parental leave is really important too. In terms of kind of thinking around benefits, I think that's also another conversation that people are looking at, and especially in terms of where people are at, what they're asking for. What role do you see really holistic benefits playing in the retention of GEM team members, especially over the last few years?
Yeah, it's a great question. And like I think it's one of those, if you asked me 5 years ago what holistic benefits looked like, I'd be like, what are you talking about, Christina? And now it's just like, well, of course we have to think about it from a holistic perspective and the whole person perspective. And so some of the things kind of carrying on the train of the parents at GEM, we're seeing a change. Like folks are sort of coming into that stage of their life that they want to become parents. And so over the last year, we've instituted things like carrot fertility and dependent FSA. I think a lot of our benefits were really tailored to the type of gems we had 2 to 3 years ago. And as those gems mature and as we hire new gems that have different life choices and life stages, how do we make sure that we're able to encompass the benefits in a way that allows for folks to have choice, at least? I think no surprise to anybody over the last couple of years, but the focus on mental health benefits has just been a huge focus for us, not only from instituting something like Spring Health, but but also an additional stipend to say, hey, sometimes we know that it's beyond just having an app, but it's what you need. So here are your options. And so I think as I think about the benefits renewal for next year and different perks we might want to roll out, to me, there's a lot of attractiveness in figuring out how do we give more options and letting folks actually choose for themselves what they want versus saying, here's your menu, yes or no. And so I'm excited to continue to explore that. And I think that's just the way the benefits world is going to continue to evolve as well.
Yeah, I mean, you never want to assume what people want and what they need. Again, having that conversation, and as people continue to grow in their career, especially at GEM as well, you want to make sure that you're consistently being adaptable and having
Right.
that conversation. I know you mentioned mental health too, which I think is
Yeah.
a great kind of conversation that has been happening, especially in the destigmatization of talking about being burned out, talking about all of the different hats that you're wearing inside and outside of work. And we know at the beginning of 2021, around 50% of employees reported that their stress was the highest it has ever been in their careers. And now we're in 2022, and that stress is continuing to be pervasive. What are the ways that you proactively prevent burnout on your team and just stress for people at GEM?
Yeah. Yeah, I do wish there was like a magic formula in some ways on this one, because I think it's also just, it's sad to see the numbers still in that way. And I think this is also one of those areas people leaders have had to flex in a much deeper way in the last 2 years than I think ever before. And so at GEM, we're doing a lot of the things that I think many companies are, like even things like the flexible PTO. We have company-wide wellness days. So really every month at GEM, you either have some sort of holiday or company-wide wellness day, which is always nice to have a 4-day work week at least once or twice a month. But I think that it's sort of, and then there's an evaluation perspective, right? Like checking in on engagement surveys on workload, stress level, ability to talk to your manager about things that are happening beyond work. So we're really, really mindful of actually evaluating some of this as well. But I think the most important piece that I've been feeling more recently, as I'm coming off of a trip to Tulum for a Pilates retreat,
Yes.
is actually leadership role modeling. And so big shout out to Steve, our CEO, who not only takes time off, but is actually off. And so we have made a very intentional decision as an e-staff to actually go talk about it. So at my team meeting this week, I talked about the Pilates retreat. I talked about, sort of the grounding it gave me. I deleted my email. If you don't have leadership exemplifying those behaviors, how can you expect anyone else to? And so to me, that's been a really helpful and beneficial sort of just exempling, showing, actually doing it to your employees in a way that I think has been beneficial.
Absolutely. It's one thing to have flexible time off. It's another thing to see that leadership is taking it and not, I think we've all been in situations where people kind of hide it on their calendar or they don't talk
Yeah.
about it when they come back. It's like they didn't take that time to reset, and just kind of being transparent about that, role modeling that behavior is really important as well. We're also in March 2022, which is Women's History Month. And this week we celebrated International Women's Day, and the campaign theme this year was around breaking the bias. And again, this is something we should be thinking about 365 days a year, but want to ask at this point in time, how are you kind of breaking the bias at GEM?
Yeah. Yeah. When I think about this, that is the first thing that comes to mind. It's like, I'm going to say a few things, but I never, ever want it to feel like, and we're done.
Yeah.
And this is checked the box for us. But I think on this journey for GEM, I think some of the things we've done that I would say have been quite early for our stage. One is that, where does bias show up the most? It shows up in hiring. It shows up in performance. It shows up in compensation. And so that's not to say bias doesn't occur in other places, but as I think about how do we systemically think about breaking bias in different areas, a few of the things we've done are, for performance, we take a look at promo rates and our performance ratings and looking at them from a distribution perspective and making sure that there isn't any bias that's creeping in, that those distribution rates look quite similar. As a part of every new hire's onboarding, we have unconscious bias training that everyone is expected to go in and engage in a discussion in a way that we're creating shared language. I feel like it's it's a special place at GEM in some ways, that I think because of some of those practices, we've enabled people to raise their hand and say, wait a minute, something feels off here, Heather. Let's talk about that. And I think, you can do a list of things, but if at the end of the day, you haven't created the opportunity for somebody to raise their hand and ask a question about why something sniffs and feels a little like bias, and that work is kind of lost in some ways to me. You can put as much of that into place, but I want to hear from others.
Yeah.
So, we've got calibration, we've got the bias training. We do a pay equity study on an annual basis. So there's, again, continued conversation around this. And to me, I want to make sure we're really double checking on where bias can show up in the most kind of prevalent places as the starting point, as I'm starting to audit some of those things.
Yeah, I think everybody has kind of that ownership in a sense of breaking the bias in their processes for the internal work, that self-awareness, and just continuing to have a growth mindset too. Just because something worked, a year ago or even a couple months ago doesn't mean it has to be the same way now. I think that if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that you need to be agile and really need to have that open kind of opportunity for change. And we've seen a lot of people test things at large too, in a variety of ways across departments, and really lean into innovation and talent management strategies. And I'm sure you've done the same thing at GEM with the employee experience and engagement. Have you kind of tested or innovated anything recently that you want to share with folks who are listening?
Yeah, if you talk to my people team and you saw sort of some of the plans we have, one thing that I have always talked about is, how do we create an environment where people feel like they can do the best work of their career? And so when you start taking that lens and you start thinking about things like people working out of their homes on a regular basis, or having the desire to be in the office once in a while but can't do that, I would say, again, this is a journey as far as what we're thinking about at GEM. But one of those things, included me thinking about a remote employee experience manager. We are going to have folks in the office and also not in the office longer term. And so to me, it's like, great, we have an office manager, but who's actually thinking about the experience from a non-office based perspective?
Sure.
And how do actually those roles work together, in the sense that, similar to how you'd have a site lead for an office space, how do we create some of that advocacy and like top of mind for a huge part of our GEM community? And so that's a role, if you know anybody, that we have open today. I think we've also been trying to do some fun things around just like little surprises that are able, like little pieces of delight that are able to show up at somebody's house and nobody knows they're coming.
Yeah.
And so we've been able to pull some of those things off. I think from a developmental perspective, one thing we're experimenting with, and I feel fortunate that we can do, is, how do we allow folks who are interested in trying different roles across the company experiment for 2 months, that we've got a very set experiment for them to go in and see what being an engineer for 2 months looks like, with clear guidelines, and then the ability to transition into that role if all goes well. So those are a few things that we've been doing that I think have been landing well from an experience perspective, particularly on that last example. One of the things we're trying to mitigate is access to opportunity. And so how, creating a program like that, creating that opportunity for people to raise their hand at the right time, with manager approval and all of that fun stuff. But, how do we create sort of that similar equitable playing field for folks longer term, is something that's continuing to be sort of a top of mind from an employee experience perspective.
Yeah, that investment in career development and internal mobility, kind of trying something different, upskilling, and having the opportunity to shadow too, and just and learn
Yeah.
as well is really important too. And there's a ton of research out there that supports that.
That's
People
right.
feel empowered by having those opportunities too, and just seeing that the company they're working at really is walking the walk too. Going back to our earlier
Yeah.
conversation. Heather, is there anything that I kind of didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or underscoring 1 to 2 key takeaways you hope people bring with them?
Yeah. I think there are two things that have been really important to me over the last couple of years. And I think at this time at GEM, one is where you can, transparency is everything. It earns so much trust. And so finding a way within your company and what that means and having leadership actually leaning into that creates that community, creates that culture in a way that isn't just saying all the good things or editing for what you want people to rah about, but it actually brings the community a lot closer and talking about the hard things as well. And the other piece that my team is probably sick of hearing me say over the years, which is clarity is kindness. Brene Brown,
Yes,
like
Renee Brown.
if there is any quote that I reference more, and when I think about my work every day, that giving clarity to people, even if it's saying, I don't know the answer yet, and you can expect to hear the answer hopefully in 3 months, like that's a form of clarity. And I think over the last 2 years, leaders and organizations that can lean into that clarity and understanding that that's actually kind, um, I think will have better retention, better loyalty from their employees longer term.
Yes, transparency, and love a good Brene Brown quote as
Yeah.
well. Heather, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the organization to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.